how do I know that I'm not in a simulation? Like, how do I know that all these people around me are not like non-player characters, that my parents are non-player characters? And I would like, how do you know? Okay, it doesn't matter if I'm in a video game or a simulation or whatever this is, whatever this reality thing is, I like it and I'm gonna stick around.
Knowledge is this ever-growing pursuit of beliefs that consistently challenge themselves and explain more and more about the world. The idea of who I am is changing on a moment-to-moment basis. You know, all of us can reflect on who we were 5 years ago or 10 years ago and realize that we were completely different people.
We could give people a mirror of themselves and their beliefs about the world. Like, that could literally help people self-actualize.
One of the greatest spiritual teachings is the idea of no self, the idea that you are not a persistent being in the world. Can you take a step back and stop looking at the world as just a set of facts or a set of capital T truths, and have an operating system that enables you to systematically question truths and produce new truths over time? I want a different view of a recommendation engine where I say these are the beliefs that matter to me.
If you had to explain Epistemic Me to a 5-year-old, what would you say?
Yeah, so first of all,
Between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space lies our freedom and our power to choose a response. Viktor Frankl's words resonate deeply with me because my life has been about understanding that space, how we think, how we feel, why I am the way I am, why I think the things I do, and how I can connect with others and with myself. My name is Robert Ta. I'm a product leader, entrepreneur, and founder. And my purpose is to map human belief systems with empathy and accuracy as a tool for self-awareness, and also as the foundation for AI alignment. I really believe that if we don't fully understand ourselves, then how can AI understand us in the future? And there's 8 billion of us all figuring it out as we get more experiences, as we live longer, as time goes on, that shape us, that shape our beliefs. So who's building the programmatic representation of everybody's models of self? And I see that as a fundamental problem to solve. And that's why I'm launching this podcast, is to bring together a community of people that want to build a better future together, not just in this particular problem set, but anybody that is a fan of a build in the open approach, anybody who is interested in building a better future together. We want to build a community around this because I really believe that if we unite people from different disciplines to work on this problem, then we can best solve it. Before we get into the podcast, I'll just give you a quick flyby about why I get so much energy talking about these concepts. So to share a little bit about my why, I grew up in an immigrant family with an older brother who I was very close to. I put myself to college. I ran my first business there. It was a private tutoring business to be able to pay the bills. And I used to have a lot of limiting beliefs. I had limiting beliefs around mental health and emotional health. And I realized that was a cultural thing. And at some point in my journey, I realized that held me back. One of the most defining points where I realized that was when my brother called me one day, and he called me and said, "Hey bro, I'm not doing all right. Can I come over for a month?" And I said, "Of course, I love you." And I only had one bed at the time. I was pretty poor coming out of college. And that month turned into kind of a crash course and roller coaster on like getting up to speed on mental health, understanding the symptoms that I was seeing. Like, he would call me at work and ask, "Hey bro, are you trying to kill me? Are people out after me?" And I was juggling launching my first product during those days, and I'll never forget the stress and anxiety of stepping out of a work meeting and he calls me and it's some new paranoid delusion. And that really blew my mind that he could even believe that his brother of decades that has loved him all his life could really believe that I was trying to kill him. And so one of the biggest dreams I have for this project, if we are successful, is to be able to map my brother's belief systems and other people like him, give that data in a way to a doctor or psychiatrist so that they could work through those beliefs. Like, what is a paranoid delusion? How do we represent that? And how do we help you with that? How do we give you the tools to be able to map out whether this belief is really yours or not? And how do we help you evolve that? So I started this podcast to build a community of like-minded people with shared values who want to build a better future together. Here's what you can expect. Awesome guest interviews, other entrepreneurs, founders, leaders, researchers, scientists, builders on the front lines, building a better future together. Team deep dives from the Epistemic Me team with updates and radical transparency with all the nitty-gritty behind the scenes, trying to bootstrap a global open source project to change the world. And so if any of that sounds interesting to you, hit subscribe, give us feedback. We read all the comments. We'll read all your questions. And if you have any feedback for, how it's edited, the topics, the guests, let us know. We would love to know. Have a great day. Enjoy the show. Welcome to the ABCs for Building the Future podcast, where we bring on founders, entrepreneurs, leaders, researchers, and scientists who are working on big things with big stories to tell. In particular, this is the first episode of our podcast where we're talking about a project that we're working on. And so we're going to spend some time introducing ourselves, the project, the problem statement, the solution statement, kind of the problems we seek to solve, and our philosophies behind why we want to work on this problem, why we see it being important. So with that said, I think, Deen, do you want to intro yourself? And then we go Jonathan, then I could intro myself, and then we'll get into the list of questions we have prepared.
Sure. Yeah. So, hey, I'm Deen. I am currently living in San Francisco in Nob Hill. I work as a software engineer at Stripe and been building Epistemic Me on the side with Jonathan and Robert for about the last 6 months. Yeah. So just to cue off some of those questions that you asked, Epistemic Me is really the toolkit. The way I see it is it's the toolkit to ask the right questions about anything that you have questions about, whether that be health, problems that you're facing at work. It's a way to introduce systems and structures, or as we call it in philosophy, epistemology, about how to question your own beliefs and ultimately find the truth. And it's something that I think we think is missing in AI today, or at least the observability of how that's being done.
I'm Jonathan. I'm also in San Francisco. I'm a serial entrepreneur, and I have been working on Epistemic Me for the last 6 months. Dane and I met at a party here in San Francisco and just had this awesome philosophical conversation. And that turned into we should build this kind of momentum pretty quickly. It's part of a long journey and understanding sense making and collective intelligence. And at a previous startup I built, I had worked on a number of different projects modeling team dynamics and individual sense making dynamics, and started to develop this ontology, this system of looking at the world. They called it the explainable meta learning framework a couple years ago. And it was a little bit complex to explain to people. I thought getting this idea of what beliefs are in a way that they can be predictive about how we understand the world could be a really helpful initial point to understand how philosophy can interact with AI and help us work with philosophy and help AI to understand us. So that was the kind of initial idea, making a belief system that could explain how you think about things day to day in something that related to you personally, be a way that people could see the power of understanding their individual sense making, understanding their individual capacity to make decisions. And yes, in AI, take a quiz and then understand you better and develop a set of beliefs. And I think that's really one of my underlying beliefs, is that philosophy is the tool that can help us evolve AI in a way that is human aligned.
Cool. Thanks, Deen. Thanks, Jonathan. I love how excited you both are to just dive into talking about Epistemic Me. A little bit about my background. And then I think actually we should talk about the origin of this, how it started from that party. So I think the next thing I want to go into is ask you a little bit more about that conversation. Then we can go into some of the questions we prepared, because I think that would be interesting for the audience to know the origin story and the evolution. I'm a product leader and entrepreneur. I have a background launching products at Workday and working in product architecture, as well as integrations consulting. I have a patent for some analytics work. That's something I really like. I like data, and I like data about health. I like using data to verify beliefs. And so I got talking to Jonathan because we're connected through a couple mutual communities, and somebody connected us. And we started talking and we just totally hit it off. And he started describing this project. And it seemed like I had skill sets that could maybe add to the mission of the project and further it. And I am pretty stoked about it. Like, it's a different way of looking at a problem and solving it. And the way that I frame it, because we're all just diving into the project, the way that I frame it is, if we don't fully understand ourselves, how can AI understand us? I think that's what this is. I've always been a personal growth nerd. So this type of project where we could give people a mirror of themselves and their beliefs about the world, that could literally help people self-actualize. Like, that's so cool. So I want to go back to the origin story. Tell me more about meeting at this party. What was the party like? What was this conversation? How did you even get into talking about, let's start this open source project that should be a global thing? Like, now that's what we're thinking, right? But like, how was that conversation like? And then how did you start collaborating? I think that would be interesting to know.
Yeah, it definitely didn't start off as let's go work on this open source project. I think it was very much a natural conversation. I think that Jonathan and I just happened into. I don't know what was the exact trigger point, Jonathan. I think it was David Deutsch's The Beginning of Infinity. Um, David Deutsch is this theoretical. He's really famous for some of his theories about quantum mechanics, but he's also a philosopher, and he has this epistemology which he's laid out about how to assess what's true in the world and how to form these explanations about how the world works. So he lays out a lot of the concepts which actually are reflected in some of our docs that need to be these things that are falsifiable, and that knowledge is this ever-growing pursuit of beliefs that consistently challenge themselves and explain more and more about the world. And I think that was just a concept that we really hit off on, and that led to a series of walks in the park, and that led to a series of like, okay, how do we put this into code? But yeah, Jonathan, I don't know if that's how I recall it. I'm curious to see what you would add to that.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah. It was a little while ago, the conversation. So I think we covered a number of topics, and I just remember it being something like where I'm thinking about ideas like metaphysics and philosophy and evolution. And there's probably a certain set of topics I'm like looking to talk to people about. And I remember feeling maybe in the wrong place to talk about this stuff. And I was fairly close to leaving the party. Dean had ran to my wife and they were chatting, and then I was about to go, and then all of a sudden we started talking to Dean, and we probably talked like 30, 45 minutes or something like that about this broad range of topics around AI, around philosophy, around evolution. And it was, yeah, just when you meet somebody, you can talk about the details of what you're really interested in. Is just immediate kind of resonance. And so I remember that. And then we followed that up with the meetup over in Hayes Valley, took a walk and discussed these topics quite a bit more. Um, and I think Dean comes from a point of view of consciousness and like through meditation and meditation practices. There's a certain exposure to those ideas that I think that if you're thinking about those questions, then you are thinking philosophically. You're thinking about what I mean in the world. And like it makes it easy to connect about meaningful conversations in that direction.
Yeah, I think I actually thought that was really fascinating because I think Jonathan hit an interesting point there, which is I approach philosophy from the perspective of Eastern meditation, which is really about inquiring within yourself. And in a way, you could argue is doing science on your own beliefs that you witness with as they come up in your mind. Jonathan is a very like systematic and structured thinker, and he can come up with all the references on the fly and lay out this whole overview of philosophy. I was really impressed. I think I had come into Western philosophy by sort of grabbing the concepts where I could and applying it to what I discovered about my own mind, particularly like how to think about epistemology, how to think about what's true, what is ontology. Jonathan introduced me to the idea of teleology, which I think was a novel concept, a term I hadn't heard. And I think that's actually become quite important within Epistemic Me. And maybe, Jonathan, you could speak more to the importance of teleology and how that fits into what we're doing.
Yeah, I think my philosophical journey, there's a lot of Eastern traditions in philosophy, and Western traditions is what we normally think of in philosophy, the Plato, Aristotle, Kant, lineage of thought. And I think the idea of who you are as a person manifests in these aspects of thought, right? And so in one question of what are you as a person, or what is a self, and then what is world, are questions of metaphysics. And when you think about it, metaphysics wraps the context of all epistemology. Like anything that we know is seen through this lens of where do we define, how do we define the world? How do we find ourselves? What are concepts of the world? What are concepts of the self? And then you get into aspects, beliefs about those that can populate an epistemology. And then I think the longer you look at the problem, you realize that you're coming into the world is also wrapped in a context. And that's what I call the teleological context. It is one of purpose, And not like in a soft sense of what purpose is, but rather if you think about what are the beliefs of how I got here in the world and what are the beliefs of what the world will be when I leave, then you get an idea of what does the world mean without you. And those are like underlying beliefs that I feel like everybody brings into their thinking about the world. Whether you think that like God invented the earth in 7 days and you're brought here, belief underlies all the other beliefs that you have about things that you see in the world. If you think you're a product of 3.5 billion years of evolution on Earth, how do you explain the idea that one day there was not a chicken on Earth and then another day there was a chicken on Earth? These are what teleological beliefs get you. How do I change as a person? And that developmental journey is also explained by teleological beliefs. So,
Yeah, coming up is this idea of what is a self? That idea of like, who am I? Because it seems to be that the idea of who I am is changing on a moment to moment basis. All of us can reflect on who we were 5 years ago or 10 years ago and realize that we were completely different people. So if we're trying to encode this idea of what is a self, we inherently need to wrap it in these series of different contexts. And I think that's where that's where I think the software angle came into play, where we realized, this is a lot of what software is meant to do. It's meant to store things that version over time and provide access patterns to them and enable you to work with these pieces of data. But I think we started to realize that a lot of what we were talking about were things that we could model in software, particularly this idea of the ever-changing self.
If you had to explain epistemic me to a 5-year-old, what would you say? Because I think everything we've said so far, maybe a 5-year-old wouldn't really know. But if we did had to explain it to a 5-year-old, how would you explain it?
I have some ideas there, Jonathan, if you want to go.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So first of all, I wouldn't use the term epistemology at all. And frankly, I wouldn't use any terms. In a way, like my first gut instinct is to say, I actually think 5-year-olds embody like the philosophy of epistemic me better than some adults. 5-year-olds are always asking questions and they're asking the questions that they're not supposed to. My family members always tell the story of when I was 5 years old, I went up to someone at a party and I was like, why are you bald? And like this inherent curiosity to figure out like, what is the world and why does it work the way it does is something that I think all children seem to inherently have. If I were to try to explain this particular concept, it would probably be in the same way you try and teach science to children. You show them an experiment. You try to teach them a single concept where there's an idea that you're trying to show them. I think a common childhood experiment is like, does this item float? Like, does this candle float or does this coin float in water? And you ask them, hey, do you think this thing is going to float in water? And then you have them place it in water and see whether it floats or not. And they record their results. And it's this idea of asking questions and recording what happened and using that as evidence to structure your beliefs about how the world works. And then you end up with conclusions based off those beliefs by running experiments. So I see epistemic me really as a way to do science on a variety of different things, whether that's your own health, your own beliefs, a way of asking questions, structuring the evidence, and then coming up with well-reasoned conclusions.
I like that. It's like democratizing science or the scientific method for different verticals or domains that you're interested in. I appreciate you sharing. Jonathan, you have any thoughts about that? How do you explain this to a 5-year-old?
Yeah, I like that aspect of how to explain that surface area to a 5-year-old. And I think the surface area I'd probably carve out would be a subjectivity. And how do you know what it's like to be another person? And just, I think the idea that we all have our own unique subjective experience and that we can't really know what somebody else is, what it's like to be them, but in like the sense of the hard problem of a consciousness. But to invoke a thought experiment about like, how might it be different to be me than to be you? And it's interesting that you ask about a 5-year-old because I think there's a guy named psychologist named Selman who did experiments, and I think it was 7 or 8 years old, where kids could look at pictures and they can see on one hill looking at something from a different perspective, and they can actually conceptualize that people are coming from something from a different point of view. And I think that's maybe like the developmental stage when you can really get a deeper idea of that the whole world isn't just you and your point of view, but that there is like other people that also have a point of view. Like you have a point of view and other people have a point of view too. I was from Texas. That was like a tradition you did at birthday. Is you hit a pinata, the stick, and like candy would fall out. And he was like so excited for candy. And I was just looking around, and I remember thinking like, these kids are not thinking about what I'm thinking about right now. Their beliefs is that they're gonna hit that pinata and they're gonna eat this candy and it's gonna be the best thing in the world. And I'm like, I'm sitting here in line. Do I have to be at this birthday party? And having a distinction of self versus others. And so I think once you get that that distinction of self versus other, and then you can get an idea of how can we actually characterize that? And I think that calling Epistemic Me a tool that can create these things called beliefs that characterize how your subjectivity is different than somebody else's subjectivity is maybe like one of the core things I try to get across to a 5-year-old.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting story as well. Like, it's interesting to dissect that. Like, what if we put that into Epistemic Me, like a kid that is thinking, when am I getting out of this birthday party versus a kid that is like, hey, when am I going to get candy out of this? To answer the question myself, I think I would try to make it as simple as possible. So one thing I was thinking is like, kids probably don't like vegetables in general. So maybe give them a piece of broccoli and then show them a video of somebody actually eating a piece of broccoli and liking it and showing them like, hey, this can happen. Like somebody can actually like this, and just show them like there is a difference. And then say why, say something like, why is there a difference? And then they might say it's yucky, or I just don't like it. It doesn't taste good to me. And then try to explain, okay, so that makes you you, and this makes them how they view broccoli. And does it taste good or not? Whatever, there's many reasons behind it tasting good to them, or maybe they just like it for health, or maybe it's a cost thing. There's many reasons. But let's just say they like it, you don't. There's a difference. So we believe that there's a difference between everybody on Earth, like 8 billion people on Earth. And we believe modeling that out programmatically would make a big difference to helping people become their best selves. That's how I think about it. So that's interesting. It's hard to actually talk about these concepts because they're not like super simple. And it actually took me some time to grok everything. Remember, Jonathan, when we first met and you're describing the project, and I was like, this is really cool. I don't yet know what this is, but this sounds really cool. But then when I viewed the object model and data model, I was like, oh, okay, like this is making more sense. So I think another thing that people would want to know about us is really like our why and our experiences that have like brought us here to be interested in this problem space. So this next question is to kind of nudge at that answer. Take us back to the first time you became fascinated by how humans think and behave. What lit the spark? Might be trying to get out of a birthday party, for example. How did that inform your journey so far in life, career, and personal pursuits? So when you became fascinated by the way humans think and behave, what lit that spark? How did that inform your journey to be here working on this?
Yeah, I think for me, I think growing up, I had a natural curiosity about subjectivity and how we see things differently in the world. I asked myself a lot of questions about that time frame I was talking about with the birthday party. I was also thinking about like, how do I know that I'm not in a simulation? Like, how do I know that all these people around me are not like non-player characters? That my parents are non-player characters, and I would like, how do you know? And you can't prove it to yourself. And I would drive myself crazy as a kid trying to make sense of. And I came to some answers as an older person, but I just like confused confused myself as a kid, being like, no, prove it to yourself. You don't know this. You don't know that everybody else is not a non-player character. Phonetics principles. And had taken these ideas of like positive and negative control feedback loops and applied it to biological sense making. And I was like, whoa, why didn't they teach me this in school? I could have used this understanding of feedback cycles to understand how we make sense of how people think. And it really sparked off this intellectual journey where I said, I have to get my head around this and understand how we can model how we think. And it took me into ideas of psychology, of sense making and collective intelligence. And just, I didn't know philosophy as a tool at that time, or like really how to explore ideas. And it was like a little bit different. This is probably pre Wikipedia, right? So I had just in the intellectual journey and the shape it took was much different than you might have today with all the information at your fingertips. It led to a project that I called Perception Labs. It was about modeling individual subjectivity and applying that to, like, say, business processes or things that we get done. And it was a way of looking at the world. So I remember, so that was what really sparked it off for me. It was an article about cybernetics, Norbert Weiner, learning about the ideas of applying, feedback systems to biological sense making.
Dude, when you said the NPC thing, I was dying. I died laughing. I was just over on mute, just dying laughing, thinking about younger Jonathan, just wondering, are these NPCs? Like, as if you're in RuneScape or something like that. PC, like, they're,
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of disorienting, kind of scary as a kid. You know
yeah,
what? Okay, it doesn't matter if I'm in a video game or a simulation or whatever this is, whatever this reality thing is. I like it, and I'm gonna stick around. And like that was just kind of what my young mind, how it made sense of that question.
one
Jonathan,
question. Go ahead.
yeah, that story reminds me of like a young Einstein who I think read like Kant or something at like the age of 13.
Yeah.
And, in him just like wrestling with these Kantian ideas of like, there's nothing beyond my perception and just like digging himself into a deep like thought loop. But it's definitely not a very unique experience to have those kind of realizations at such a young age.
Yeah. It actually provokes another question, which I want to hear from you two. Do you think purpose is objective or subjective? Like, what do you even think about purpose? I'd love to talk about that in a sec and then tie that into our project and why we're working on it. Um, but I think one thing that I also want to make clear to those listening. So Epistemic Me is an SDK for people to build applications on top of that require deep personalization and understanding why your users are the way they are, the worldviews, their belief systems. So a grounding use case can be, hey, I am a health practitioner. I use some in the future to be made app that helps me with my patient intake. I understand more about my patient, like, oh, they are from a smoking household, or hey, they're from an immigrant family. So now I have cultural context. So when I make a suggestion about their care, then it has a likely higher outcome percentage success in outcome of better health outcomes, right? So that's like an example of what we're talking about. We're working on that base SDK, and those are applications on top that we aim to make possible. What does it mean to a 5-year-old kid? But I just also want to clarify, what are we actually doing? It's this SDK. We're stoked to launch it in a few weeks. And we're also stoked to roll out this podcast and talk about our why a little bit. So Jonathan, you talked a little bit about, when you became fascinated thinking about people as NPCs. That's interesting in itself. We'll follow up on that in a sec. But Deen, I'd love to know when you became fascinated about how humans think and behave, and how did that inform your journey?
Yeah, so I was definitely not a philosophical prodigy like Jonathan. I think I started asking a lot of these questions much later in life, particularly around the pandemic. So I actually, during the pandemic, I ended up staying in a one-bedroom apartment down in San Jose near where I grew up, kind of like holed up by myself, for close to a year and a half. And like many other people, I think I suffered through, you know, a lot of like mental discomfort and really just started to question a lot of things that were going on in my life. Up till that point, I had been extremely motivated at work, very intent on pursuing certain goals. And suddenly I found myself placed in a world where the goal wasn't really clear anymore, right? Once I moved to San Francisco, um, the specific way I picked it up was through the Waking Up app by Sam Harris. I actually wasn't ready for a lot of what that app, and it's really to hit you directly on the head, which is with one of the greatest spiritual teachings that Eastern spirituality has, which is the idea of no self, the idea that you are not a persistent being in the world, and a lot of the reasons for your suffering are because you believe that you are a distinct entity in this world through self-investigation, within almost a month, I feel like I had a pretty profound spiritual experience where I directly saw through that lens. And it led to all these downstream outcomes in my life where I found myself improving my relationships, picking up new habits, doing a lot of things that I'd always promised myself I was going to do. It wasn't through forcing myself to do those things. It was through examining my own beliefs that were blocking me or getting my own way. It was this realization that it was through subtraction of my own beliefs, not through adding new beliefs of who I want to be, that in many ways I could become a better person, more aligned with my goals. This idea of examining beliefs was very powerful. I realized that a lot of these concepts were in ways described by many people for thousands of years throughout philosophy, in some ways around the same central topic of metaphysics, as Jonathan mentioned, of like, what is reality? Who I am, who am I in this reality? If you read Plato's Republic, Socrates, you could argue, comes to many of these same conclusions, where there's the famous allegory of the cave, right? Where you have an individual who grows up in a cave and he only sees the shadows of the world as it really exists projected onto the cave in front of them. So he has relationships with the shadows, which are ultimately projections of the real world, but not with the real world itself. Um, and it's this process of seeing the world for what it really is through learning to move past the shadow. And what I see the shadow here as is, and I think in terms of epistemic me, an incompletely evidenced belief. So that was kind of my background, how I got into and trying to understand psychology and the role of questioning beliefs to kind of improve oneself, but also to better understand the world.
So, what's your meditation practice? It sounds like that completely transformed your whole life. So, that's my follow up is like, what's your meditation practice?
It's actually this practice called do nothing meditation.
Cool.
So, yeah, really just sitting down for anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour and studying your own mind. And
Mhm.
in a way, it's a lot like just taking notes. You say, oh, I'm thinking about this. Well, and then taking a step back and not approaching it from the perspective of necessarily, I am the one thinking about this, but the mind is moving that way and asking the question, well, why is the mind moving that way?
Yeah.
Um, and if you do that for enough period of time, you start to realize that your mind moves in predictable patterns. And you realize that a lot of the underlying structure that's causing the mind to move in a certain way is your belief systems.
Yeah. I really like what you said about the concept of the no self. I was first exposed to that from, I don't know if I'll pronounce this right, Thich Nhat Hanh.
I'm
Yeah.
familiar with them.
Yeah. And he brought a lot of Buddhism into the West via his like different ventures like Plum Village. And so he has this concept of no self. And it always makes me, when I think about that, it makes me more grounded. I don't know if that's your experience, but I actually do this when I eat. I think about how many people it took to get the food on my plate for me to be nourished and fed. Somebody nourished it, grew it, took it somewhere, sold it, and then they put it at Safeway or the farmer's market and I pick it up there, you know? I think that's so cool because it makes you realize like, wait, like I wouldn't be here without anybody else. And that thought in itself grounds me. It's very comforting because I think it just makes me appreciate life and makes me grateful for just like living every day. And it's awesome to hear that we connect on that idea. Do you have any more thoughts on no self or how you use that philosophy in your, you know, daily life?
I mean, I think you just said something really fascinating and profound that no self leads to this sense of groundedness. And the question is why? I don't think it's a coincidence that almost every single spiritual tradition around the world stresses this concept of interconnectedness,
Yeah.
that you are not an individual by yourself, but you are part of this broader community and everything you do impacts others and everything others do impact you. And that's why there's oftentimes these moral frameworks or these standards for living that seem to emerge from these different spiritual traditions. I think no self is an interesting way of backing into interconnectedness. right? It's a very systematic way of removing belief systems and realizing, oh, wow, you are me and I am you. But interconnectedness is a very grounding idea. And I think there's a lot of different ways to back into it. No self is a very profound way that is almost life shaking in a certain way. And I think it's one of the most powerful ways to do so.
Jonathan, you have any thoughts to add to that concept of no self or interconnectedness?
I mean, I strongly relate with the notion and the thought tool of like, how do you bring yourself to a point where you can like really kind of see things for what it is, in that, you really don't know, and you're also part of this broader, interconnected, highly complex system of the universe, or whatever you want to consider reality to be. And a lot of the narratives that we have that construct our model of self as we engage in culture and society and the things that we have to get done every day, are sort of a form of illusion that's really helpful for us to navigate that reality. But yeah, if you just turn and deprive your senses and really just pull back belief after belief, that, you can conceptualize, just kind of an interconnectedness with all these things. And I related to that, with the broccoli, right? You can be this like mindless machine that just like shovels food in your mouth, or you can conceptualize the broccoli for what it is. It's like this amazing thing that came from a supply chain, that came from people planting that seed, that came from a seed that evolved over time, that came from chemicals that are part of, the solar system, and in our and we're all just children of the sun. And then you're sitting there with your broccoli. We both came from the same spot, and yet, you know, I mean, and what does that mean? I didn't think that's so many meaningful lenses to look at things from different points of view in relation to the rest of the world.
Should I eat this broccoli? It is me. Shit. To answer the question, for me, the first time I became fascinated by how humans think and behave, I guess. So for me, I had a very different childhood than most people that I grew up with. So my parents were Vietnamese immigrants, and I was born here in America. And I grew up in San Jose for the most part. And so I just remember one of the biggest things was at home, we never really talked about things like, how was your day? Or, you know, whatever. It was just like, make sure you get A's. That's your only job. And if you get an A, then I'll question you on why didn't you get an A plus? Like that was like, and then if you got an A plus, then it's like, all right, well, your cousin goes to Stanford. What are you doing? And I'm like, well, I'm 12. Like, I don't know. I had a sleepover at a friend's house. They're awesome. And I still keep in contact with his name's Emilio. I keep in contact with him and his family today. His mom and dad, I'll hang out with them even without him. That's how close we've gotten. They're like another family figure for me. And so I had a sleepover there to play basketball the next day. And we had dinner together, which was crazy because I was like, we never really have dinner together at home. And then we had dinner together with Emilio's family, and they asked me like, how was your day? And I was like, whoa, nobody's ever asked, well, what? I didn't think people cared about that. And so that really shook my world of how things were at home versus how things can be at all. Because especially when you grow up, and Jonathan, you kind of mentioned child psychology, especially when you grow up, like everything around you at home, your role models, your caregivers, those are what give you structure. And that's the mental architecture with which you come into the world and what you think is normal. And so the thing that challenges the belief system is a disruption in what you think is normal. You might see how somebody else lives. Like I saw like, oh, you could do this. You could just have dinner together and ask each other questions about your day, and that matters. And that feels nice. Like I like that. So that was when I really got interested in it. And then fast forward, I got really interested in how do I improve myself. Later in my teenage years, I grew really fascinated about personal growth. And then in my early 20s, I decided to check into therapy to try to improve some of my bad habits and like toxic traits. So then I just kept reading more about how, why we are the way we are, things like that. Like everything from like personality quizzes to attachment styles to like relationship psychology and stuff like that. I grew very interested in. And I think it just gives some order to chaos. Like there's like, lots of, we're all permutations. Like we're all kind of snowflakes. We're all very unique, but there's also patterns because we're made of water. So it's nice to know those. I don't know. It's very pleasing for my mind to know those things. It just makes things easier to accept and consume. So that's my reason. I wanted to ask a follow-up question. Purpose. We talked about that a little bit. Thoughts, high level thoughts on purpose, what you think yours is and what this project is. And do you think it's subjective or objective? I think that's an interesting conversation.
Yeah, happy to go first on this one. I think purpose is definitely a subjective point of view, and it's something that's maybe there's aspects of purpose that are conscious, and aspects of purpose that are subconscious, but they are unique and subjective qualities in each of us, and that's how I think about it. My own purpose, it, I feel like I'm an evolutionary hypothesis of the universe, and that each of our consciousnesses is like just natural selection finding its way into ways that metabolism and energy manifest itself into being and becoming for us to take for the universe to just test hypothesis of fitness and staying alive. And I think at the end of the day, we're all part of this the life that life has taken. And I just look at myself as part of that ancestry. I am accumulation of my ancestry and how things have changed over time. And I'm also just a manifestation of what that means in today's environment, in today's world, and like how to take that information and make sense of it. And I think it comes back to practical things like what are the existential threats and risks that we face as individual humans? What are the threats that we face as an ecology and as a group of humans? And I think that's one of the reasons that I is drawn to the ideas of the philosophy of sense making and collective intelligence, because I think we have to understand ourselves and our individual capacities. And if you really try to just understand why did I perceive this thing this way, you can't nominally describe it, right? Like you have to go back to what are my sensory organs and where do they come from? Like what is this sort of stack of homeostatic processes that it is me that is making sense of the situation today? And how did my ancestors pass on this cultural knowledge, these homeostatic habits from my human ancestors, my hominid ancestors, my primate ancestors, my eukaryote ancestors? What did they learn and teach me that is now influencing my perception of the world right now? So to to understand yourself in terms of being and becoming, in that sense of like how am I seeing the world on an ongoing basis in the being sense, but also what am I becoming over time, and how's my sort of morphology, my embryonic sort of self, like expressing itself in the world? How is that changing? And I want to see myself from my inception to wherever I'm going as like a changing, morphing being. And then you get into the aspects of collective intelligence. And so if we're all individually acting like this, what does it mean for us to act like together? And how do we then take on like the group sense making capability to contextualize, to ontologize existential risk and continue down that path of life as a collective? And when you start asking those questions, then understanding our subjectivity and our intersubjectivity and working together in sort of marketplaces and representation systems and the constructs of the rationalist enlightenment, but applied to a philosophy of being and becoming that really takes intersubjectivity into context, it's the missing equation in terms of like how we live our lives today. And I feel like that becomes an operating system for how we as like individuals come together, become something bigger than ourselves, and make like representation systems and societies that can steward our self-interest, steward our like existential or fight against existential risk. In something like Epistemic Me that helps do that is, to me, is like the operating system that glues it all together. So to me, that's like the overarching purpose.
I like that framing of it's an operating system for purpose. I also like when you said purpose of the whole evolutionary purpose. Of course, I think that's one thing to put in your brain. Like we're here to like evolve and stuff. And I'm just one part of a bigger thing. But then when you break it down, like for example, you have your work identity and then you have your relationship identity or your hobbies, things that make you you. So the way that I've been thinking about purpose and identity is like there's facets of it. So anyway, that's just one more thing to add to the equation. I am curious to chase down this thought, which is epistemic me is the operating system for that. Dean, I see you smiling over there. Do you want to extend that thought and add on to what Jonathan was saying about that?
Yeah. The way I see purpose actually really ties into the epistemic portion, I think, of epistemic me. If I were to state my purpose, it would be to seek the truth. And the natural question is, well, do you mean capital truth with do you mean truth with a capital T or truth with the lowercase t, right? And that's like a philosophical can of worms as to what is the truth. I think truth as a process is much more interesting and much more easy to grasp rather than truth as ontology. I don't think you can ever really grasp that. But I think what you can grasp is a process of systematically questioning beliefs and producing new truths as an outcome of doing that process. And I think that's what epistemology is to me. It's the process. It's not the ontology. Um, you could conduct epistemology and produce useful ontologies along the way or facts about the world. And I think coming back to what Jonathan said about the operating system, can you take a step back and stop looking at the world as just a set of facts or a set of capital T truths and have an operating system that enables you to systematically question truths and produce new truths over time and not see it as just a static belief, but questionable, falsifiable beliefs. And that's where I think that that operating system analogy is useful, just like an operating system for a computer helps you run the right processes for you to develop higher level applications. Epistemic Me helps you conduct the right processes to develop useful truths.
Now I'm thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs as a pyramid, and then epistemic me. Like I have this visual in my head of like, oh, we solve for some of these lower level things to help you even uncover more truth about yourself. Because I think that's really at the core of a lot of this is we're all trying to figure it out and uncover truth for ourselves. So I like how you framed it as it's more interesting as a process versus a collection of just objective facts out there, which is maybe Pandora's box of a philosophical problem. So, okay, that's really, I think it would be interesting to talk about this one, which is what does success look like for epistemic me in 5 years, in 10 years? What do we envision there? We actually, I don't think we've like really talked about this in detail from each of our individual point of view. So it'd be good to get this out there and talk about it now. Who wants to start us off?
Yeah, I think it's been super interesting in terms of the conversations all three of us have been having about epistemic me. Because if you go back to the idea of it being an operating system, the natural question is like, well, what are all these different applications you can develop on top of the operating system, right? So I think like framing that 5-year, 10-year conversation might be around what are some useful applications that I might see in 5 years versus 10 years? I think one application I would love to see in 5 years is a more personal recommendation engine that I have control over. I don't think models of self are necessarily a new concept. Facebook has been doing this successfully. TikTok has been doing this successfully. The problem is there's no observability into what that model of self is, and there's no control over it. I can't go into Facebook's model of me and say, okay, it thinks that I believe I like these videos, or I'm the kind of person who wants to grow and wants to learn. The way I have to tune these recommendation engines is by going in and saying, oh, don't recommend me this, don't recommend me that, and then hope that it starts to model my beliefs or my projections of how I want to grow over time. I want a different view of a recommendation engine where I say, these are the beliefs that matter to me. I want to grow my understanding of the world. I want to grow my understanding of science. And then the recommendation engine acts according to my belief systems that I've programmed. So this ability to now bring back control to the individual when it comes to how to sense make in a world that's like throwing tons of information at you, right? You want to be able to sort based off your beliefs, not based off what someone else thinks your beliefs are. And then I think in 10 years, it would be really cool to start to see science become more of a data-driven enterprise, not at the level of science necessarily, but at the artifacts that science is producing. I think like the default way of interacting with science today is to go in archive and read some like 10-page PDF that someone has created, which makes it very difficult to, ideally, I should be able to take two different publications and compare how they both use the scientific method to take input data and produce output data and then produce conclusions in like almost a schematized form. And I could imagine a world in which if science is done through a platform that has agreed upon schemas like Epistemic Me, you could conduct your investigation within an epistemic framework, and the OS would take care of producing the artifact that's grokkable by data, AI, all by itself. So you could start to reduce the amount of manual work that needs to be done in producing the artifacts of science and start to focus more on the science and get better artifacts as a result. And I think that's what I would love to see happen in 10 years, whether that's through Epistemic Me or whether that's through larger developments in AI.
Yeah, I like the framing that if it is an operating system, what are the apps on top? And then it sounds like from what you're saying, there is a need for representations of your model of self that is controllable by you so that you get better value and optimize value to whatever news or feed or information so that you could sense make, so that you could evolve your thinking better. That makes a lot of sense. Jonathan, do you want to talk a little bit about what success for Epistemic Me looks like to you in 5 to 10 years?
I really like Dean's framing, and I think I'm just going to talk about it from some of those angles too, like the aspect of technology meeting the humanities, as in we have all these ways of interacting with each other in society and in life, and now we have this like technology introduced, and it's rapidly accelerating, and it's rapidly changing the way that we interact. And if you look at something like a recommendation system, we're like we got the technology before we understand ourselves well enough to understand how to communicate to the recommendation engine, right? And now we have this problem that like we're recommended content by something that I think the people that run it don't fully understand and can control, and that we don't fully understand and control, right? And okay, that's a problem, but I think it's just a challenge for us to introduce these tools, right? That in ways that are beneficial to our values. That I thought was well stated. And then with science, I think we have a methodology of peer review with science, but there's clearly something like missing to everybody. There's a reproducibility crisis. And I think this is articulated to me as a human who has to manage my own body in a healthcare system. And you have all these doctors that are trained in traditional conventional medicine that have been taught like a particular like methodology for causality, in that there's a symptom that you as a person are a series of symptoms to be addressed by drugs or by surgeries to produce an outcome that produces like a symptom-free version of you. But then if you go to your doctor and say, why am I feeling low energy throughout the day? Or you give a why question to a doctor, they don't have the tools to answer the question. Like these incredibly intelligent people with the best education system Western civilization can provide don't have a model of causality to explain or explore root cause. Um, and I think that's where, from a need perspective, that's where you have things like functional medicine trying to explain things in terms of like metabolic health and underlying root causes for why we have these symptoms in the first place. I do feel like something like our understanding of causality as applies to our system of science is incomplete, and that this notion of subjectivity, intersubjectivity, can give us the tools to address how technology meets the humanities and how causality plays out in ways that help us answer questions that are missing right now. And I think this manifests in a lot of different ways. In terms of what I see as success is that we could apply Epistemic Me to use technology, to use AI to understand not just experts and how experts can do jobs better, but to use it to apply to every aspect of our being. And I think when we talk about like artificial general intelligence being broad enough to understand the why questions and to be able to take understanding that we can diagnose a symptom at one level, but then explain it through a systematic understanding of the homeostatic systems that our body is undergoing. That's if AI can understand who we are at the cellular level, at the tissue level, at the organ level, as us as humans, and it can construct a holistic model that takes all of those things into account as we need to learn about ourselves and we need to solve problems. That's what I really see would be success. And I think that unlocks a number of different sort of tools that we don't have available to us today: more efficient marketplaces, more expressive and representative representation systems. And I think we start to be able to point our resources at things that really matter to all the representatives in that representation system in terms of existential threat, and just making political decisions that are explainable and balanced and have a notion of causality that makes sense to people.
I really like that response, Jonathan. I'm thinking through what you said, and the visual that comes to mind. Did you guys play video games growing up at all?
For sure.
So I played, like World of StarCraft, like, or Diablo. And so in those types of games, there's like a fog of war. You're a character, you're exploring, you don't quite see the map. And so I kind of see Epistemic Me as like the thing that gives you more clarity. There's less fog of war. It clears out the fog of war, or it helps you figure out the next place to go better. That's how I envision it. Like the way that Jonathan put it, I was like, if this were a video game, if we are living in a video game for one, and then we built this thing, and then every application in the future is built on top of it. Epistemic Me understands everything about you, the cellular level, tissue level, the consciousness level, even integrating things like no self, like as a philosophy, all those things. Like it basically gives you what's the cheat code for the next step to self-actualize,
I love
which
that.
is, yeah, like it helps you clear the fog of war. It gives you a cheat code. So I could describe real quick what I think success looks like in 5, 10 years. I see this as it has to be an open source project. Like I think it's the underpinnings of solving the AI alignment problem. Because like I said at the start, I think we can't have, and I think this underscores what Jonathan says. Like, I don't think we can have an AGI world if we don't have a programmatic way to represent ourselves and our beliefs and the way we view the world. And then furthermore, have that evolve with us, right? I think that's the thing to solve. And I see this as a need for every application type. Because if you fundamentally look at it from a first principles lens, knowing a person at an intimate level across the way they think about everything, every domain in life, that could be applied towards health, as you just covered. That could be applied towards relationships and finding a good partner. That could be applied towards so many other verticals that might make somebody's health, like it could be financial health. It could be like, well, maybe you would like this kind of job, not the job that you're in. It could be anything, but all of it, when you abstract it to first principles, it's optimizing value delivery, right? Like personalized, like to the person, because we're coming at it from the beliefs point of view. So with that said, I can see every dating app using Epistemic Me SDK to better personalize matching. I could see things like Airbnb leveraging Epistemic Me SDK to recommend, for example, oh, we know about Robert from data that he owns that he gives us access to. We know that he likes the mountains. He doesn't really like rooftop bars. So we'll never recommend him that. Like anything that is really just, we need to know more about you so we can optimize value. Like that's all it is. It's just matchmaking of that. Very low hanging fruit items are health, how you view your sleep, if it's important to you or not, how much you view that it affects your health, like your cardiovascular health or your metabolic health, disease risk, like things like that. I think that is the most low hanging fruit thing that can be built on Epistemic Me. In 5, 10 years, if we're successful, hopefully Epistemic Me is a global open source project that has sponsorship, has funding. It's in a virtuous cycle where it gets constant development. And there's what I call the Human Expertise Council, people that understand metaphysics, people that are at the edge of behavioral science, people are at the edge of neuroscience, psychiatry, all these different fields work with more in the future technical contributors to shape and refine the SDK for the betterment of humanity. I think that's like the vision for if we're successful. So yeah. Do you guys have anything to add to that? What I just talked about?
Yeah, I think the question of why this is open source, and I think, Robert, you're
Yeah.
planning to eventually lead into that, is a really
Yeah.
fascinating one.
Let's
And
talk about it.
yeah.
Do you want to give some thoughts? Why should this be open source?
Yeah, I could give a lot of philosophical reasons as to why I think it's be open source, but I think there's also just some practical things that I've been observing when I use a lot of the more popular AI applications like ChatGPT, for example. If you've noticed on Twitter, there's a lot of people, it's like a popular trend to go and ask ChatGPT, oh, create a picture of who you think that I am. And you'll find that ChatGPT actually creates this pretty accurate representation of who it thinks you are. You know, for me, it had like my guitar, it had a couple of books that I was reading, had me running outside the window. There was still no way for me to go in and understand how it knew that, right? Like, I couldn't explore the beliefs that it had about me. I couldn't even explore the facts that it had about me. I had to trust this chat-like interface and trust the entity behind that chat-like interface to have my best intentions in mind if it chose to go do anything with this model of me, right? So that was concerning. And it felt like to me that if we were going to build models of self, um, there's an inherent responsibility there to do so, to act in the best interests of those who you're modeling, right? Because if you have a really accurate model of someone's self, there's a lot of attack vectors there, right? You can do a lot of things that are immoral, and we've seen, like in the Cambridge Analytical scandal, that actually happened in real life. So building out an open source, I think, makes your intentions public. I think it has a side effect of keeping your intentions pure, because you're constantly forced to reinstate your intentions and keep them out in the open with the public. So that was the intention behind open source for me, is if we're building models of self, how to do so in an ethical way and in a way that actually keeps people's interests in mind.
Yeah. I like what you said about the incentives, like keeping the actions towards this peer and the incentives peer, building out in the open reinforces that feedback loop.
Yeah, I feel really aligned with what Dean was saying about the open source nature and the need for it. I had some thoughts, Robert, while you're talking about the aspect of matchmaking, and
Yeah.
you
Feel
know,
free.
you talk about empathy quite a bit. Ever since I first met you, empathy is like one of the top topics where I think epistemic me, it comes into matchmaking, is being able to sort of like see somebody else's beliefs and perspective take their point of view. And I think this also comes back to the open source aspect of like, what exactly should we enable, like sharing, what should you share of yourself, and what enables, and I think the aspect of matchmaking, be able to open up aspects of yourself that help you connect to other people, is one of the key things. And I think it was one of my motivations in starting the project too, was when I was listening to a lot of health podcasts. Like I'm a complete health nut, and while I'm exercising, I'll listen to health podcasts, and so I'll like hear these nuanced perspectives from people like Peter Attia or Seem Land or Rhonda Patrick, and realize that these really smart people, when it comes down to interpreting research, they will interpret it differently. And like it comes down a lot to, what do they think? What are their health goals? What does it mean to be healthy? What are my ideas of longevity? Do I want to live a healthy 100 years like Peter Attia, or do I want to live like an infinite number of hundreds of years like Brian Johnson? And that these overarching like beliefs, they come down to practical decisions about what should I do today to my body in order to. So if you think about being able to empathize with that perspective, and if you have a set of beliefs and you can look at a set of thought influencers and see how those beliefs overlap, it's an easy way to picture the empathy that you can derive and the perspectives you can take. And one of the goals of Epistemic Me is actually to bring those perspectives into your own ontology and into your own sense making, from a point of view of, I can be the sum of the people that I want, that whose opinions I respect the most, and that I can use their perspectives to sense make. And so if you think about being able to take people's perspectives, be able to put them in your own ontology for sense making, and then those people have perspectives, and perspectives is perspectives. And if you were to like download all the things that Peter Attia said, you'd be referencing scientists who are referencing scientists who are referencing scientists. That creates like an in-level perspective taking that also is meant to be conceptualized in your epistemic me ontology of self. We haven't had a chance to implement perspective taking yet, but I actually think that'll be a really fun aspect of it. But then you go to the open source aspect of, okay, now like I have controls over my beliefs, which beliefs I share to connect to other people, and everything's explainable. And then I can look at, what are the reasons that Peter Attia recommends that I should do 300 minutes of zone 2 per week or something like that. You get an explainable sort of definition that comes like perspective to perspective. So I can empathize with all these people. I can sense make my environment along those lines. Yeah, that's just a picture. And when you're talking about matchmaking, this is what I see in my mind.
Yeah. That's cool. We just came up with another feature to build. We have a never ending backlog. So that's cool. That actually reminds me of what Deen just built, which maybe we can give a quick plug of that, because I thought that was such a cool use case. Deen, do you want to just give a quick plug of the philosophy, like strategy plugin feature thing you just built, which I think highlights, I don't know, it sounds very similar to what Jonathan was just talking about.
Yeah, I think it's an idea that Jonathan and I had both talked about in kind of the early stages of Epistemic Me. If you actually go into the code base today and you go into like the AI helper section, you'll notice that whenever it's investigating a user's belief, it pulls like a meta strategy philosophy that we wrote about how to actually investigate your beliefs. Um, and I think it opens up this interesting question of what is the role that a coach plays when you're investigating your beliefs? A coach adds their perspective, but they don't tell you exactly how to think. Others could specify their philosophy in a way that works with Epistemic Me. We could now collaborate with those influencers within Epistemic Me to bring my own model of self and shape it in a new way based off their perspective. And I think there's like an unlimited number of things that you could do with perspective taking. But specifically what we implemented was we actually took your writing, Robert. You wrote this great article on, I believe it's Respond, Don't React, a strategy really about how to deal with more emotional trauma and childhood trauma. And I could definitely see someone who wants to maybe use Epistemic Me to investigate some of their more inner beliefs that have to do with childhood trauma. They want to work with an authority. They want to work with a psychologist or someone who's thought deeply about how to actually overcome this trauma. So it's not necessarily about them adopting your strategy, but it's about them investigating their own beliefs and Robert's strategy coming in to assist when necessary. And I think in a way that's a formative and I think we will build it.
The empathy angle, better understanding of oneself leads to, I think, more fulfillment, more growth, better understanding of other people, even more so, it compounds. And then it fits into this broader vision Jonathan and I have talked about, which is like collective sense making. Like if we're all of humanity and we have billions of people, that's complex, that's a large N number. So if we can look at the problem as decrease friction of understanding yourself and other people, N number of other people, that would be a good thing overall for humanity. So I think in a lot of ways, Epistemic Me, to me, like I'm framing the problem that way. So why should it be open source instead of proprietary? You heard from Deen and Jonathan. From myself, I would say to be successful, it has to be open source. Like if I just think through what are the capabilities required to build something like this, I think that we can get to some levels of fidelity of success. Success meaning if I personalize the value to you in this particular vertical, whether it's matchmaking of dating, whether it's matchmaking of buying the right thing, whether it's personalized recommendations as a life coach or whatever, every vertical, all these applications on top, which we'll talk about in a sec. Think of it like Epistemic Me's goal is getting 100% personalization and 100% prediction accuracy. That's the goal of it, right? Because we want to understand you. We have this model that understands you. It evolves with you. We use that as your representation to optimize value in any vertical or application or domain. So to do that well, I think that's going to require a lot of like, whoever is on the cutting edge of these different domains that make up human behavior and how we think and our brains coming together with technical contributors to implement the SDK. So like you can't have, to me, if you took this and just scaled it out to infinity, this is as good as it can be. It's 100% accurate. Maybe it's 110% accurate or whatever. Like if a Facebook, just invested a bunch of dollars into this, they would invest 50 million or whatever. They'd spin up teams around this. At some point, they're going to be capped, even though they probably have a lot of tailwinds because they have money. But at some point, they're going to be capped because there'll be researchers and stuff that can work with them that can't. And so the reason why I think this has to be an open source thing to solve it fundamentally is it is a problem that requires so many different domains of expertise and capabilities and skills to come together across the globe, like across people, period, to get to that 100% or over 100%. So that's my thinking on why it has to be open source, let alone the morals and ethics. I just think like to solve it well, this is the model to solve it well. I think y'all covered more of the morals and ethics and value use cases, but I'm looking at it. I'll just add my perspective from an operational lens. I think it has to be solved this way. So, okay, use cases, because Deen was just saying like the lines are a bit blurry between like infrastructure, SDK, apps, products. So would love to hear this next question. If we're in the year 2525, 400, 500 years from now, what are some of the long-standing use cases we will see built on epistemic me? So we're dead at this point. We're freaking, well, maybe
Figure
actually,
yourself.
well, maybe we're not dead. If Brian Johnson is successful, maybe we're not dead. Maybe we're still alive, or maybe our brains are somewhere, powered somewhere, maybe with epistemic me. So what are the use cases that you would think have been long-standing, like core use cases for the world?
You really want to go 500 years out, huh?
Maybe if you want to pick a different time frame and give an answer, I'm cool with that too.
Well, I think the world is changing so fast. It's hard to know, what 10 years is going to look like from now, what hundreds of years is going to look like. And so it's a question about like, what do you want the world to look like in 500 years? And I think the path I would pick is that as a society have found ways to work together to mitigate existential risks. And I think it starts with what are the risks created by technology? First, we had the Industrial Revolution, and it created this risk of like climate change. And that could kill us within 500 years. And then we have nuclear weapons, and then we have social media, and now we have AI. And so I think the first thing that I want to imagine that we are going to survive in that 500 years time span is that we can create and regulate technologies as a civilization, and that we have a way of discussing the trade-offs that we want to make so that we can stay value aligned as a civilization and survive, right? And I think that in the core operating system of that, you have to have representation of every sort of living sentient being that we want to consider inside the domesticated sphere of humanity, like all the plants that we raise, all the pets that we have, every cell in our body. If we're representing those into a representation system that can say, yeah, here's a decision about evolving together using this new technology, and here's the trade-offs that it will take under this like universal representation system of all sentient beings, that we can make those decisions without killing ourselves. And so, yeah, and in 500 years, I would hope there's some kind of mechanism like this still ticking, which is like let's be able to make decisions together and survive together.
So it's that collective sense making, like the collective fog of war, making sure that we're just surviving and making that collective next step that is good for humanity. Like we still exist and we're thriving, hopefully.
Seems like a good foundational feature. Yeah.
Not bad. Not dying is not a bad goal. Dean, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think I actually might take a slightly different perspective here. I think what I hope to see true in the world 500 years from now isn't necessarily some sort of outcome, but that the process of truth seeking remains alive, and this propensity to challenge beliefs, no matter where we think we are, right? It's very tempting to think with today's science that we figured out the world and that we know a lot more than someone knew 500 years from now. But if you look at the set of all knowledge as being infinite, then us not knowing infinity is the same as them not knowing infinity 500 years ago, right? So there's still a lot more to discover. And there's always the possibility where you reach a certain stage, and maybe to play devil's advocate, you've reached this collective sense of what is good, and you've prevented the capability to ask questions in certain domains and seek the truth. And I hope that's maybe where the spirit of epistemic me, whether it remains as an application or as something else, remains alive, where it's continued to foster that ability to question underlying beliefs, question dogmas, question value judgments, and continuously seek truth, and see truth as this and knowledge as this continuing endeavor. So really, it's almost as if I hope to see certain things the same, the process as being the same, like that the process that kind of came out of the Enlightenment that really improved so many health outcomes in the world, improved our standard of living. Yeah, I mean, it also brought a lot of terrible things to the world, like nuclear weapons that Jonathan discussed. So there is obviously risks involved. But I hope to see the core philosophy, the core process remain true. And in a way, if we could codify that in epistemic me, there's a higher chance of that artifact remaining 500 years from now.
I just had this cool thought based on what you just said, like codifying that. What if we made a model of self that is the collective of whoever is working on epistemic me, and that involves with us? Somehow we like figure out how to make this. And it's this thing that just is an organism that evolves from all of our collective thinking. That'd be pretty sick, actually. Like imagine transforming user onboarding, where that's like, you have to talk to this bot all day for like a day. Here's a bunch of questions. talk to it. Or maybe at this point in a few years, the bot could create videos to communicate, or like it literally is a robot that you could talk to.
I
Sorry.
love that user onboarding idea because I think you're touching on ideas of identity
Yeah.
that people have talked about for years prior to the whole AI hype cycle. Is often this very like crypto native idea of like, how do I take my identity and transport it anywhere so that
Sure.
one, I reduce friction. I'm not entering the same birthday information on 500
Yeah.
websites, but at
Totally.
the same time, I can securely transport it. Yeah, this question of identity um, and trust and risk, I think are
Oh,
actually
right.
have a pretty deep intersection here.
I think so too,
Yeah.
actually. So I'd love to, you know, unravel this thread because I have my first startup was in crypto gaming. And so like I have a lot of thoughts on Web3 and I keep up to date with it in general. And I think data ownership and identity ownership is a big thing. And we're essentially talking about these models of self. That's something that's interesting to talk about amongst us three. Like, what do we imagine that looking like in the future? Like ownership of your model of self.
I hope that I maintain full control over my model of self and that my beliefs aren't just publicly open, to everyone to investigate. There are a lot of beliefs that take time to incubate, right? There are a lot of beliefs that I know are probably wrong right now, but I need time to clarify and then before I publicly state them. And I think it starts to bring up this question of decentralized permissioning, right? When I go to any website, let's say that's a government website or a dating app, I want to share a subset of my information, a subset of my beliefs that it can then use to take a partial version of me to go out into the world, but not necessarily the whole me. And I think in order to do that, you need to make beliefs discrete in the first place, right? If it's just this amorphous AI
Yeah.
model that's like a compressed version of me in 1 kilobyte, you can't divide that. You can't think a lot of the ideas. If you actually look at the way we've implemented a lot of the epistemic me stuff, everything is temporal. Everything says like, oh, I could go look up what my belief system was 2 days ago. I could look at it what it is now. And conceptually, that's very similar to the concept of a chain, right? So
But yeah,
yeah,
you're right.
yeah. And it actually is a chain, and I have a lot of thoughts on crypto and its ability to scale, but I think in its core philosophy, which is how do you version things over time? How do you make everything accessible, but at the same time private? That's a very interesting idea that could be baked into the core building blocks of Epistemic Me. Like, so for example, today the SDK stores all data on the server. One way to make this more private over time is to actually make the SDK capable of storing data locally,
Yeah.
where it stores less and less data at the level that someone runs it that could run on device. So I think there's a lot of possibilities here. And there's a lot of previous thinking in terms of identity. The payments industry has a really vast literature on how to think about risk, identity, permissioning, how to use your identity to lower like authentication costs. So there's a really cool way to think about this problem from existing literature.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think in the future, if we solve some of the UX problems in crypto, then this is more tangible to me. Like, hey, I literally have a record of my model of self, like only I can access it. And it actually provides me a lot of value. I think right now my assessment is the UX of crypto is just too high of a bar for it to make sense for a user, like especially for an application like a health coach or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I do like that as an overall philosophy that people should own their own data and they should share wealth and monetization of it. Like ideally, that is the case in my mind.
Or at least be allowed to if they
Yeah.
want. With Apple-esque philosophy, right? If you look at a lot of the way they've designed their latest AI tools, it can run on
Mhm.
device or permissions you to run it on the cloud. You should
Yeah.
always build in the optionality to do so.
Yeah. So Jonathan answered at the, hey, let's not die as a human race example, like that layer. That's where you answered this question from. If we're there in year 25, what are the long-standing use cases? We'll see with EM. Dean kind of answered from this layer. I guess I'll throw in a very specific example that I would love to come to life because that's a different layer than you two were coming from to round out the conversation. But my brother has schizophrenia, and I would have always thought this is so hard going to the medical system to get the right care. And like my family, also, they're not super equipped, being Vietnamese immigrants, they're not super equipped with understanding mental health, let alone something as gnarly as schizophrenia and how to give for that. So I've always thought or wondered, hey, can there be a better way for everybody to understand what's going on with my brother's brain when he's going through something? Could there be a better way for a doctor or a psychiatrist to understand him in his cultural context and what makes him him to provide or prescribe the right care that would actually optimize for better health outcomes? Because it's been like kind of a roller coaster on my side with my brother's mental health and how it's impacted his overall health. And like, honestly, it's just stressful to deal with as a person juggling life as we all are, but then also you gotta, be a caregiver too. It's a lot. And so that's where I'm like, what if that existed in the future where we can model out my brother's belief systems about the world and then expand that to anybody with any mental health issue or disorder or disease. And then we could better help people. I think that would be so great because what a therapist does is they tease out your beliefs about the world, right? Like Dean was saying with a coach earlier, same thing with therapists, but maybe in different verticals of your mind. Sports coaches do the same thing. A lot of it is teasing out your worldviews, belief systems, and then teaching you a new perspective, and then it evolves, right? So I think the same thing applied to mental health in particular would be very powerful for society, especially with the way things are going. We're going to be more and more online. Like I really think Ready Player One is just like that's going to happen. We're going to get to this future where VR is commoditized. It's like low cost, the jump in the matrix or whatever. And like, I just think this is probably going to be more needed too, the mental health use case. So that's what I would love to see still in 25. Like we've had millions and millions and millions of people or billions helped with their mental health with a better understanding of their minds, the way they work. Okay, so we talked about why should it be open source. We talked about, a little bit of our own individual backgrounds, why we're interested in this problem. We talked about what this will look like in 10 years if it's successful, or 5 years if it's successful. And now we just talked about like year 25, where Epistemic Me is powering humanity to keep surviving. And we have cool apps on top of it. And it's helping the world, right? And so, okay, let's round this out because I know we've been going for a while. There are two questions I want to just get everybody's perspective on. Where we're at with the project, I could maybe cover most of that. And the second one is, what's our community for this project going to be about? What do we envision that to be? And how can people get involved? Does that sound like a good way to round this out, guys?
Yeah, that sounds great.
We are finishing up the repo, the GitHub repo, and making sure that it's all tidied up and ready for open sourcing and to gain contributors and have people on board if they would like to build on top of Epistemic Me or contribute to the core SDK. And we're going to roll out a newsletter as well, so you could stay subscribed. And weekly, we're going to have a very build in the open model. So we'll share all the nitty gritty behind the scenes of bootstrapping this open source project and building it out and trying to save humanity in the future. So yeah, keep posted for all that. I'm pretty excited. And we're going to get into a model of churning out weekly launches. So updates to apps on top of Epistemic Me or updates to the core SDK itself. To answer on what the community is going to be about and how people can get involved, I really see this as people that are interested philosophically in the mission that would love to just read about it and learn about it. I also see this as something that would be interesting for people that want to contribute to a cutting edge project, that want to be at the forefront of humanity meets technology, right? As Jonathan outlined. And then I also see it as there will be customers of Epistemic Me, people that are building applications that require deep ways to personalize value and optimize value for your users by understanding your users better and why they view the world the way they do or their beliefs. So that's my thoughts on community. How you can get involved is we'll throw a website link out there and you could join our email list and then you could reach out to us via our emails. So yeah, I think Dean had pretty strong thoughts about the type of contributor. Dean, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the core contributor that I think we're hoping to get as soon as possible is a developer or our developers who are interested in contributing to the code base, right? Contributing to our Epistemic Me server backend, as well as the SDK. There's a lot of topics that we talked about in this podcast, like permissions, how to create better and better models of self over time. We're looking for folks who are broadly interested in those ideas and really want to write some interesting code and start to contribute to our code base and help it grow over time. Also, folks who are just interested in improving the technical quality bar. One of my motivations with this project is to really improve my technical skills over time while working on a topic that I find intellectually stimulating. So folks who want to write interesting code, develop interesting servers, infrastructure code, think about what does the future of AI-driven software look like? All are welcome there. And then I think there's a second type of contributor who doesn't necessarily need to be technical, but I think, Jonathan, we find oftentimes are very technical, is the philosophically minded person, the one who is interested in improving the concept of epistemology. Ideally, a philosophy PhD who's thought about this for 10 plus years or so, who can really help us craft our definitions, help us think about, is our system using effective epistemology? And then for more interesting applications like perspective taking, what are some really cool perspectives that we can start to get folks to start interacting with? How can we use Epistemic Me to get philosophy into the hands of more people and have them start to question their own beliefs? So there's a second type of contributor there who maybe doesn't have a very clear path to contributing, but would make the project just 10 times better. So we're looking for both types of contributors. And I know Jonathan also has some perspectives on this, so I'll hand it over to him.
Yeah, no, I love all that articulated. I think what when we launched the project, I think one of the most concrete things that we'll see is the example app where it's based around question and answer chat. So just imagine Chat GPT, but you've prompted it to ask you questions, and then you're giving it answers and responses as a user. And I think one of the key things we want to see there is that you can see your own beliefs and context. So as you give it answer back, the interface will return the beliefs that we've extracted through the Epistemic Me server. And I think that hands-on and like wanting to just evolve that chat experience is a core vector of contribution where I think there's a really interesting evolution to the current like interface of Claude and ChatGPT and other tools where we can like just have a question and answer that can actually learn you well enough to start predicting your answers and predicting the beliefs that will show up in your answers as you answer questions. And we'll be demonstrating that through beliefs about diet, sleep, and exercise, health. And just picture that the questions that it should ask are going to ask you are going to get smarter and smarter. And we want to demonstrate that. But I also think we talked about this Stanford study that was done recently that could predict people's answers to questions based on previous chat that they've had. And that study, what it would do is it would replay the chats and then evaluate them with expert perspectives, like sociologists and psychologists and stuff like this, to help predict how somebody might answer a question in the future. And I think we can drive this sort of chat experience towards something where it's question and answer, but it's not expert opinions you're expanding. It is the underlying beliefs of the individual that you're expanding, and be able to compare the two approaches to one another. That could be like a really concrete short-term goal that it's going to require some resources, going to require quite a bit of iteration and evolution, but it should be something that you can feel getting better and better. And you can also then take metrics to show that it can be more predictive of a system. I think that's an interesting sort of short-term goal to think about.
Yeah, I'm pretty stoked for this, like giving people a little robot AI mirror of themselves that learns more about you and helps you even just see a mirror of your beliefs. I think that's going to be really exciting. So, one other thing before we close out the pod, we're going to have more regular podcasts. The current goal is maybe one or two a month, and we're going to launch weekly. We're going to get into a cadence of doing launches every week. So we'd love to build a community around this. If you have feature requests, look out in our GitHub. We're going to have documentation on how you can make feature requests, how you can contribute, how you could be part of the community of Epistemic Me and be part of saving humanity in the future. So this has been a wonderful time and conversation, Deen and Jonathan. I feel really grateful that I get to work on this problem with such awesome, great people. So thanks a lot for joining me in this conversation to just share some of our vision and perspective for the future. And I'm stoked to keep building in the near term and long term. So this is an existing thing in 25.
Sure. Yeah.
Dean, do you want to wrap and give a quick shout or say bye? And then Jonathan, and then I'll close it out.
Yeah. I also just wanted to extend a thank you to you, Robert. I think that you've demonstrated like a really incredible ability to understand how we bring this very like hairy, like I've said the word epistemology to like 5 of my friends and they're like, please never say that word again to me, you know? But like, I think you've really helped us shape the perspective on like, how do we make this accessible to folks? You know, how do we develop actual apps that are making an impact in this world? And yeah, thanks so much for leading this podcast and like, I think bringing out a lot of thoughts that I didn't even realize that I had when I was able to clarify on this. So
Yeah,
really
we're gonna have
excited to
more.
work on this with you.
We're gonna have more dope conversation. Jonathan, you want to say any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I echo the gratitude and just finding minds like you guys to expand these ideas and to bring them into something that's concrete, usable. It's really hard to find people that can bridge the philosophical aspects of consciousness with the practical aspects of utility through software, and it's a really cool foundation to like expand on.
Definitely. I'm grateful I met you guys, and it's cool to be able to zoom out into like philosophy. Why should we think about this at all? And then zoom in to like, how are we integrating this in the SDK? It's like very cool. So cool. All right, guys, we will have more space and time to do this in the future. Excited for next time. Look out for the January launch, everybody. Have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.